Hi everybody, it's Plessis here. I just want to give people a few more seconds to log on and then we'll get underway. Okay, I think we've got the green light. Thank you very much and good morning to everybody. I hope you're staying safe during this lockdown period. And hello from Lihle Game Reserve, KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. On behalf of the Endangered Wildlife Trust, thank you so much for joining our wild chat together apart. The presentation will begin shortly, but before I get started, there's just one rule, and that is, should you have any questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to type them in, and we'll answer as many questions as possible after the presentation. Okay, let's begin. Hello again. My name is Plessis, and I coordinate the Wild Dog Range Expansion Project. I usually present on the nuts and bolts of conservation, the main threats, and the things that we do to mitigate those threats. But today I want to tell you a story that is a little bit more personal. People often ask me what it is that draws me to working with the species. Well, it's their family structure, personalities, and their die-hard need to always put the pack members first. And of course, they truly are an example of an underdog story. Today, I'll showcase the story through a heroic three-legged African wild dog called Lihle. In 2011, Lihle and her sisters were introduced to Mkuzi Game Reserve, and they were bonded with males that had come from Plessis and Plessis Game Reserve. These two groups were bonded to form the wild dog pioneers of Mkuzi Game Reserve. In 2012, I was fortunate enough to be given the position of monitoring this pack that I soon began to call the Super Six. But it was not long before I was exposed to some of the behind-the-scenes realities of conservation, not just the romance of it, and snaring was one of those realities. In summary, snaring is a poaching technique used to catch bushmeat. It is prevalent throughout Southern Africa and is usually linked to dense communities living on the fringes of protected areas. With a high level of poverty and very low unemployment rates, poachers come into the reserve to try capture food and take home or sell. And sadly, African wild dogs often fall victim to this. For those that don't know what a snare is, in summary, it's a steel cable that's usually anchored to the base of the tree. The poachers usually channel the game routes or the animal paths that are used most frequently, because that's generally the paths that most animals will use to get from A to B. And the idea is that as the animal moves through the snare, we've used a person in this particular case, the snare tightens and it usually captures the animal around its neck, stomach, or leg, and it usually ends in fatality. So in the early stages of monitoring Lihle and her pack, I was soon exposed to the realities of snaring incidences, which resulted in some horrific injuries and 2 deaths. These incidences were devastating, but they also gave me the push I needed to master my monitoring skills and work with a phenomenal management team to save Mkuzi 6. So here they were. From left, we had Cash, Tandifa, Waters, Tandazile, who was the alpha female, Dumela at the back, and last but certainly not least, Lihle, the three-legged dog. As months went on, my monitoring intensified. I became a little bit obsessed. I was out twice a day, every day. I studied the wild dog movement patterns. I studied their favorite resting areas. And when I didn't see them, I'd walk in on foot to ensure that everyone was accounted for. And the effort paid off. It was a few months before the snaring incident happened. The next snaring incident happened, but this was probably the most important one. Early one morning, I was monitoring the pack, waiting for them to emerge on the road. They eventually did, but Tandazile, the alpha female, was not leading the pack. It set off a bit of an alarm bell. She was always first in front. I waited a bit and she eventually appeared, but she had a snare around her neck. Tandazila had fallen pregnant a few weeks earlier. The pack needed her, I needed her, and at this stage she was a great asset to this pack and we simply could not lose her. I called for help and wow, it came quickly. The section ranger, Dennis Kelly, responded in record timing. He had called the vets, the game capture team, the reserve manager. We had the whole squadron on board. But darting Tandazila to remove the snare was no easy task. Like how most injured animals react to injury, Tandazila was acting shy and went into hiding. But after several hours of trying to wait and strategize, the dart eventually went in. I was the one lucky enough to get nominated to go and retrieve her when she was asleep. I fitted the blindfold around her eyes, put the earplugs in, and carried her to the vehicle. No surprise, Lihle was walking close behind me. We cut the snare off and the vet cleared her. She was going to be okay. Also, we got confirmation that the pups were about 5 weeks along and well on their way. A few weeks went by and eventually the Super 6 went down to den. For research purposes and accountability, we placed a field camera at the den site. It was confirmed that Tandazila had given birth to 7 healthy pups. What was more exciting is that Tandifa, the beta female, had fell pregnant too. She had 8 pups and was denning about 1 kilometer away. Now the guidebooks will tell us that only the alpha female will usually give birth and be supported by the rest of the pack. Generally, the pack's loyalties will lie to the alpha female. But this pack had a different agenda. They decided to strategically split. What made this more interesting is we now had 2 groups of dogs denning about 1 kilometer apart. At the one den was Tandazila, Lihle, and Waters. Waters was the alpha male. And at the other den site was Tandifa, Tumela, and Cash. And what was quite phenomenal about this particular experience is I'd sit there waiting each monitoring session for them to emerge. So obviously the moms would stay back with their pups and the hunting party would emerge, come together, go off and hunt. And day by day, they would come back, separate and go back to their respective dens. And I think the feeling of organization really blew me away. They were really strategizing to ensure that all 15 pups were going to make it to adulthood. A few months went on, and when the pack decided to shift to a new den, they did to shift to a new den. They do this to avoid flea buildup and to avoid threats from other predators. Over time, obviously, staying in one location, fleas do become a problem at a wild dog den site and can actually be fatal to pack and pack members. And the other issue is that over time, the smell of the pack starts generating issues. So from a strategic point of view, Tandazila made the decision to take her group, went across to the beaters den site, recruited Tandifa, Cash and all of those pups, and then they migrated to their next den. I was lucky enough to be there for this. And there you could see all 15 pups very healthy and maneuvering for the first time from one den to the other. I think what really caught my eye in that video, it was Lihle right at the back of the queue that turned around and should always be the one accounting for each of the pups. So I was in a very fortunate position of watching the pups grow up. I'd earned a little bit of their trust, and because of this, it enabled me to get quite close to them and be around them. This picture is one of the pups that the smaller one is Tandifa's pups. So Tandifa, her litter came about 3 weeks later than Tandazile's, and so these pups were slightly smaller. So this is one of the older siblings or the older cousins wrestling one of the younger ones. This is one day I was sitting with the pack watching, this particular pup was watching a bird fly over its head. This is when the pups first started discovering water holes. Obviously, denning season in South Africa happens during the winter time, and this particular dog, this was just over the rainy season when the pups were big enough to start playing in the water. This is one of the pups harassing 2 Egyptian geese. This is the pups chasing a wildebeest. I think during my times as monitor, it got more and more interesting. I witnessed them chasing a wildebeest and a zebra, then a giraffe, and then a hippo, and so on. They were a very courageous bunch. This pack had gone from 16 to a point where they felt like they were very unnoticed to a pack of 21, where no animal could really shy away from looking at them. They had suddenly become quite an elite group of individuals roaming in Plessis Game Reserve. This is just a picture of one of the adults in front, and a picture just displaying how big this pack had actually got and how big and healthy the pups were looking. What was quite remarkable during this time was just watching Lihle and her interactions though. She treated these pups as though they were her own. In fact, even during the denning period, it was often her that would stay back with the pups, and it would be the alpha and the beta that would go off hunting, and she would be the babysitter. And I think this was the reason that the pups loved her the way they did. This is another example of showing how a little 3-legged dog can still discipline and play with the pups when it needed to. And this, I call this photo school in session. This is Lihle, like facing onto all the pups. Lihle is on the left, and all the other adults are kind of minding their own business in the background. But I think what really stood out to me with Lihle is she was always that nurturing instinct she showed to her pack members and the pups in particular. And she was always the most nurturing one, and she would always be the one giving away the signs that something was wrong, or it would be a case that everything was okay and I could back off. And it was really that expression in her eyes that enabled me to make my decisions as a monitor in terms of what I needed to do. One day I was sitting with the pack and I'd accounted for all of them. This is when the pups were now about 10 months old, and they moved through a block. They went down a game path, and I knew this particular path that they were moving on. So I went around a few kilometers away, and I found them. I got there just in time, and some of the main pack members had come through, and I was counting each one of them, and then Lihle came, and she looked down at the road, looked at me, and started doing this who call. Now, a who call is generally a noise that one of the wild dogs make, that when they've lost one of the individuals, it's basically a call to say, we're here, come and find us type thing. Or if an individual's lost, they might who call and the pack will respond by coming and fetching them. So the who call is a very important vocal for wild dogs because it always helps them return. And on a quiet day, this who call can go kilometers through the bush. So this particular day, Lihle had come out. She looked down at the ground, who called, looked at me, and went down the same game path that she had come from. And I knew immediately that something was wrong. So I followed her in. And on foot, I radioed through. I called the section ranger and the head of the anti-poaching unit. They got down incredibly quickly. And as we started walking down this game path, we fanned out, and we started noticing a few different carcasses. There was a dead inyala, a dead zebra, and a dead wildebeest. And there were just snares littered right across this bush. And we knew something was wrong. And Lihle was the one giving it away to us. So we kept on walking, and we fanned out more and more. And eventually I heard a whistle come from the distance. I moved across there, and the field ranger tapped his head. and that was an indicator that there was a dead wild dog. His name was Engameli, and he was only 10 months old. And when we got to him, his body was still warm, but he had suffocated. The problem is that we couldn't really hesitate too much there because we knew that there were much bigger risks and the pack as a whole were at risk. So we had to keep moving. We found out again in our care and walking, and I came across a female, one of Engameli's sisters that we also caught in the snare. I ran towards her, took my jersey off and put it over her eyes, and then I removed the snare. She was still breathing, but she was unconscious. So I left her there, and we had to keep moving. We then found another female that was in the snare, also a pup, and we approached her, and she managed to get out the snare by herself. And then last but not least, we eventually came across Lihle, who had just been caught in the snare. Luckily, she had a collar on, but she was still too lively to go and help. So we had to dart her. And it was only once the dart went off and she started falling asleep that we were able to move in and remove the snare from her neck. At this point, I'd taken my shirt off now to put over Lihle's face, and then I carried Lihle across and put her next to her niece. And at that time, I'd waited with those dogs while the rest of the team fanned out and started removing snares and just trying to move the rest of the pack away. But it was a story where Lihle was certainly the hero for the day. We had lost one pup, but because of Lihle, we were able to save two others. And it was just kind of her heroics and selflessness. I think that in her timeline or lifeline, but because of that, she got herself into so much trouble. I think by the time I'd finished monitoring at Mkuzi, she had been snared about 5 times, and it was always because she was returning back to the snared individual to go try help them. A few weeks went on though, and the pups started coming to the yearling age, so we're all turning 1 year old. And wild dogs generally cycle once a year. They usually come into estrus about between February and March, and their gestation period is about 10 weeks. And what was interesting now is the year before we had both the alpha and beta falling pregnant, and this year we had a repeat. But this year, Lihle fell pregnant too. The problem with where they were denning was it was right in the south of the game reserve, which took me about an hour and a half to get back and forth, or just to get down there, I mean. And they also decided to set their den up quite near a community boundary. So to kind of save the time and to show a bit of a presence around where the pack were denning, we decided to pitch tents nearby. And what a remarkable experience that was. We were able to kind of wake up in the mornings and sometimes have the pack running right past us. And we got to witness quite amazing things from there. But yeah, as time went on, we camped there, I think, where the den was for about 2 or 3 months. And eventually, after many weeks of patience, the pack brought the pups out onto the road. With all the litters born, the pack had grown to about 40 and had become the biggest pack in South Africa. I built with such a bond with Lihle to the point where she would even come and leave the pups with me before going off and hunting. And this picture was taken on one of the days that I was on guard duty, and Lihle was away. Anyway, months went on and these packs all started growing up to adulthood. But generally with the big pack like this, it generally starts creating dispersals and wild dogs start moving off. For whatever reason, and we're not completely sure why, Waters, the alpha male, and Lihle decided to break off the pack and they moved onto a property next door. But the reserve they moved on did not want them, and they had to be captured and placed back into the Mkuzi Boma, which was in the heart of their old territory. There was no other home immediately available to them, and because of that, it was our only choice. For those that don't know, a wild dog boma is a fenced-off compartment that's generally situated on the reserve. It's about 80 by 100 meters in size and used for a variety of management functions. During Lihle's mission with Waters on the neighboring property, she had fallen pregnant and landed up giving birth in the boma that we had now placed them in. When the pups got bigger and older, the boma gates were opened and the Waters and Lihle would head out each day, hunt and bring food back to the pups. It was quite remarkable to watch this interaction and watch how These adults, though, that would normally be scared of going back and forth into a boma, were brave enough to come in still and feed their pups. Just kind of showed how strong that maternal instinct was. This went on for a few weeks, but one day, Lihle's fortune changed. While hunting, she was ambushed by a pride of lion. She had survived so much in one lifetime, but her time had now come. Many people ask how I felt about this. And quite honestly, in terms of all the threats that she endured through snaring and through living on 3 legs, in a funny way, I kind of felt like the fact that she was killed by lions was a bit of a silver lining, because it at least meant that she had a natural send-off, and she deserved that. This left Waters to take care of the pups by himself. What was interesting, though, is that he kept returning to where Lihle had been killed, and several days later, he didn't return either. His death was never confirmed. One might assume lions, but Waters was an old boy now. He was over 10 years old. And my feeling is that it was a term that vets use called broken heart syndrome, which is an emotionally stress-induced heart attack, which wild dogs actually suffer from. Waters and Lihle's pups were now orphans, and a bold decision needed to be made on what to do next. Captive rearing the pups would not have given the pups much of a future, so a decision was made to capture 2 of Lihle's daughters, called Enhle and Freya, that had been born the year before. They had left their pack in search of a new pack, and were the only real hope that these pups had. But then another magical moment happened. The pack that Lihle, Waters, Freya, and Enhle had left behind was still in full force and still led by Thandazile. Several weeks after the adoption took place, Thandazile's pack showed up at the boma. In most circumstances, this would call for alarm. Other dogs in Thandazile's territory could prove fatal, but this was not the case. Instead, Thandazile and her pack recognized Freya and Enhle, and to my amazement, they wanted to help. The boma gate was opened, the pack moved in, recruited the pups, and they moved off. To this day, I'm not sure what to make of this. Whether the pack knew that these were Lihle's pups, I'm not sure, but I would like to believe that they did somehow. To put into perspective what the Mkuzi pack achieved, there are only about 550 wild dogs in the whole of South Africa. They are our most endangered carnivore in South Africa, and our second most endangered carnivore in Africa. In 25 of the 39 African countries, they have become extinct. But the Super 6 went from 6 to 40. But the Super 6 went from 6 to 40 individuals, and certainly left a legacy. But what made this story more special for me is how things went full circle. A few years later, I got the position with the Endangered Wildlife Trust to coordinate the Wild Dog Range Expansion Project. Part of this work involves restoring wild populations in areas of Southern Africa where populations have become extinct. To date, in my role as coordinator, I've reintroduced offspring from the Super 6, which includes Lihle's offspring, to the likes of the northern section of Kruger National Park, Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique, Hluhluwe-Mfolozi Game Reserve, and Zamanga Game Reserve, where they have now become successful founder populations. So coming back into the question of what draws me to the species and in terms of the legacy that Lihle left behind, I think to sum it up, it's in terms of what I learned, it's the friendship that they show, it's the fun that they share, it's the bond that they have, it's the trust between them, it's the care that they have for each other. This was Waters during a hunting incident one day where he was the main hunter. He was a bit bigger than the rest of the dogs. And because of that, the pack would often push the prey into him, and it often meant him being the one getting wounded, which was quite special, as he'd always take down the prey and then move away and let the rest of the dogs feed. This particular day had been kicked in the face by an Inyala, and this is one of the other pack members coming to nurture him. This is an affection, the affection between wild dogs, the generosity between them. I think on this point, whether it's water or food or whatever it might be, it's always about letting the sick, the injured, and the weak go first. And when you consider the animal kingdom and how how tough it must be out there. The fact that a wild animal that can't guarantee its next meal can take food back to the elderly, the sick, or the injured, or the pups, and feed them is quite remarkable amongst a wild animal. The kiss, the hug, the dance, the brotherhood, and the family. So that's all for me for now. I think the pictures do their job in showing what I love about the species and how important they generally are. So I'd like to thank you once again, everybody, for attending. I hope everyone is keeping safe during this lockdown. I'd just like to end off by saying it will be a tragic day for African wildlife and its conservation if we fail in our efforts to protect this remarkable species from extinction. And in terms of a bit of a note back to Lihle, subsequent to Lihle's death, I recently adopted, well, I say recently, about 2 years ago, I adopted a domestic dog and have subsequently named her Lihle in tribute to her. On a final note, I would like to send a shout out to the Stonehill International School in Bangalore and all its students in India, New Zealand, Australia, Korea, the UK, and the United States. Thank you very much, and I'm now open to any questions. Okay, I'm going to try to do this from the top, and I'll try to see if this works. From Wendy, Cole, your passion really shines through, and I'm glad you mentioned your feelings about the female wild dog's eventually demise and how you felt about it. How you deal with your emotions in general, especially when facing the many challenges, frustrations that you face in the field. I really do like this question, and it is a tough one. It's in the world of conservation, I think looking after the animals is the easy part. You know, when we have the ability to have no rules and just focus on the species, it's quite easy. The challenges are often associated with the people and the management around them. Wild dogs still carry quite a history of, you know, among those that haven't really seen wild dogs or don't know a lot about them, they still carry this this kind of name of being wild or rabid animals type thing. And dealing with the angry farmers all the time and people that despise them is quite a challenge. But I think for me, what really gets me through the tough times are the good times. And coming back to Leash and her pack, I think this was genuinely a real, like a real thing that I've hung on to. And whenever there's a good moment in conservation and times when we've reintroduced wild dogs to the likes of Gorongosa National Park and seeing a pack of packs going up from 27 to like 54 wild dogs in the space of 2 years, I think it's a little bit of hope that I hold on to in terms of keeping up that emotion. And yeah, it's tough. I guess as scientists and conservationists, we have to often try hard this emotion, and it's not always easy. And nobody, like, you know, in terms of being a pragmatic conservationist, we don't want to come off as too emotional, but because we need to be objective in terms of really trying to make a difference. So I think it's kind of, for me, I hold my emotion close. I don't always express it, but it's what kind of fuels me to keep on doing the work that I need to do. From Tom Dando, hi Cole. It's great to hear your passion and dedication for these animals. Some good memories for me as well, and an amazing story. You mentioned them breaking onto a neighboring property that didn't want them. How many reserves are part of the meta population at the moment? Are landowners and reserves any more sympathetic to wild dogs than, say, 10 years ago? It's another great question. And, you know, so much of the strategy, obviously, in terms of our conservation efforts, so much of the focus is kind of eliminating the major threats like snaring and disease. But ultimately, it's about changing people's perceptions through education and through awareness. And we've really put a lot of effort into that through social media, through education, through workshops, and just documentaries. You know, in terms of the one that David Attenborough did, these are the kind of just exposing people to the species is, I think, what changes people's perceptions. And both in KZN and areas in, say, the Waterberg, where there's historically been some hostile feelings towards wild dogs, it often just takes a little invitation to one of the angry farmers to showcase them the dogs firsthand. And more often than not, the dogs do the work for them also, for themselves. So yeah, I'd say in 10 years, things have definitely changed. I think there's a tourism demand for people wanting to come out and see wild dogs. And ultimately, the more people that want to come and see them, you know, the more kind of economy follows that. And if that be the case, we can start expanding their space, which is ultimately their biggest threat right now, is space reduction. Thank you, Mark Murray, for the comment. Have dogs' numbers in Infillosi declined recently? Yes and no. Statistically, they have declined, but I think it is important to remember that there are troughs and flows, and with any wild animals, particularly with wild dogs. At the moment in Lihle and Plessis, there's five solid packs, each of those obviously that have alpha females that could potentially breed. So though the numbers are quite low at the moment, we're now going into denning season. And if you think in one litter you can have between 5 and 15 wild dogs, you know, if all 5 of those females have 10 pups and raise them to adulthood, you suddenly have a 50 wild dog increase, and you know, you could be back to maybe even past your carrying capacity. So yeah, at the moment they're a little bit lower than usual, but there's no telling, you know, that they could be above the normal numbers in the next 3 or 4 months. Teresa Zet, thank you very much for sharing the story. I think showing the personal relationships, investments, conservationists have, sorry, I just jumped ahead a bit there. Just trying to find this again. Apologies, I'm just trying to look for this question. It kind of bounced away from me. I think it was leading to the passion around conservation. And I must say it really is a treat working for the Endangered Wildlife Trust and some of the colleagues and partners. It's what it's really all about. And there's some very good people and special people that are very dedicated to the cause, not just with wild dogs, but you know, wild dogs is one species, but it's ultimately about saving biodiversity. And I think on that note, it's something that this coronavirus and this lockdown has really showed signs on, is that there's so much focus now on finding the vaccine to that, and which we need to do. But at the end of the day, I really hope the big high-end policy makers start reviewing things at a higher level and look at the problems that actually, or the source of the problem that caused the coronavirus, because ultimately it's prevention is better than cure. Hello, hi Mr. Cardi Plessis. I've heard that you saved Lycaons from Tembe Elephant Park. Yeah, I don't know if I saved them as such. Again, it was a management agreement between a whole lot of different stakeholders that came together and really tried to remodel things in the world of wild dog conservation. And the answer is yes. All 4 of them are doing very well, and we can only hope that they did in this year and let the pack numbers increase a little bit. Carolyn Dumford, great talk and fantastic to hear of the monitoring going on. Who was the father of the second set of puppies? It's a very good question. We believe that in terms of the second set, so Tandifa was the beta female. We did observe Cash, who was Waters' brother, mating with Tandifa on several occasions. So we do think that it was Tandifa, who I don't know if I mentioned, but she was a 3-legged wild dog, and she managed to successfully raise by the end of her life, she raised about 18 pups to adulthood. Oh, sorry, coming back to Teresa's question, I was wondering if snaring was still as big a problem now compared to when you started, or have you been able to adopt countermeasures? It's a very hard question to ask. You know, snaring is a funny thing. You can have a subsistence, you know, an elderly subsistent farmer that might go out and set up 2 or 3 snares and take the bycatch 2 back to his family. And then you can have another, say, a younger group of 3 or 4 people that might come in and set up 50 or 60 snares. So in terms of, I think the question, a good question would be, are there more people infiltrating the reserve, setting up snares, or are they just doing it more on a commercial level than they did before? It's a hard question to answer, and I think it also goes, you know, in highs and lows, and it's often is a reflection on the economy and the employment level. But it's certainly one that's very, very hard to combat, and it really kind of shines through the importance of monitoring, and why we need to keep monitoring these wild dogs. And another shout out to Wildlife Act. They're an NGO that have specialized in wildlife monitoring, amongst other things, in the last 10 years. And they run a volunteer organization in KwaZulu-Natal, and they do a phenomenal job in monitoring the KZN wild dog population. So if anybody is interested in monitoring and volunteering, then look up Wildlife Act. Luke Haynes, great story, Carl. Keep grinding away. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. A question from Leotisha. What is the smallest viable range size for a pack? It's a very good question. I have to spend a lot of my time doing feasibility assessments on the work that's for reintroductions, and it does vary a lot. A simple example is you can have a reserve like Lihle and Plessis game reserve, which has a very high prey density, and the animals do very well as the prey numbers do well, and obviously high prey numbers means that more predators can be supported. But if you look at a reserve in the Kalahari, for example, there's much less water and vegetation, which means there's a lot less prey. So even though you could have, in a place like Lihle and Plessis game reserve, you might be able to have, on average, say 80 wild dogs in the space of 100,000 hectares. But if you go to a place like the Kalahari, you might only be able to have 30 or 40. So it is quite biome specific. But generally in a place like Zululand where there's high prey densities, we have about we look at about 15,000 hectares of space before we consider relocating wild dogs or reintroducing wild dogs. Gavin Bester, how do you constantly keep motivated to keep going with the limited resources and negative sentiment towards wild dogs and farmers? It's a very good question, and I guess the short answer is diplomacy. And for me and the carnivore conservation team that I work for, the likes of Grant Beverly and Derek and Vincent and Joseph and Kulani, you know, I think a lot of the skill is not always conservation related. It's more about being a diplomat and remembering that you're there for the animals versus yourself. So I think we've all learned how to be sworn at and shouted at. But at the end of the day, I think if you just remember what the reasons what you're there for in the first place, it helps you get through those moments. And coming back to those small victories, there's nothing more rewarding than changing a negative farmer's perception on African wild dogs. I think in the case of the Waterberg, through Derek van der Merwe's great work up there, he had a landowner that was particularly negative towards a pack that landed up denning on his farm, and just through him, Derek, and the work and kind of showcasing the pack to this farmer, this particular farmer went from being one of the wild dog haters to actually being a community ambassador now for the wild dogs, and has even sponsored money and a collar towards them. So I think diplomacy, having the right temperament, and just listening to people's opinions on the matter is very important. Janine Winfield, thank you, Carl. That was fascinating and a very emotional story. Amazing work. What is the most dangerous disease for wild dogs? This is an incredibly important question because disease are the major threats to African wild dogs. In the last 6 years now, we've lost about 55 wild dogs to disease, and that totals about 6 packs. And those are combined between the canine distemper virus and rabies. So I would say at this point, it's a 50-50% in terms of danger. The good news is we've got a great team that we work with, a veterinary group that falls under the Wild Dog Advisory Group that we coordinate. And they've been working very hard at establishing vaccines and trialing vaccines, which have gone a long way into protecting wild dogs. So now whenever we actually reintroduce wild dogs to the likes of Gorongosa or anywhere really, it's about 100 Rand to vaccinate a wild dog. Generally, we give them the rabies and canine distemper vaccines, and then 6 weeks later, we follow on from that. But yeah, certainly that is one of the major diseases. And again, because of the human densities around the protected areas, it's often domestic animals that can carry these diseases, and it's only often a fence that divides the wild animals from the domestic animals. So it's an ongoing threat, and what's very scary about this particular threat is how widespread it is. If we look at canine distemper, it's hit us now in the Kalahari, in Madikwe, in Lihle and Plessis Game Reserve, and in the Kruger. So right from west to eastern South Africa at different moments in time, it's killed whole packs at a time. So it's a very important thing that we need to stay on top of. What kind of illnesses is the most dangerous? I think that kind of ties back to the disease. As I said, rabies and canine distemper. So from Shelley, for our international students, how does a pack interact, alpha, beta, choosing mates? It's a very good question, and I think I can only answer half of that. Generally speaking, we sometimes, whenever we reintroduce wild dogs, it's a very interesting conservation exercise. When we're trying to create a founder population, like in the case of Mkuzi, we took males from Mfolozi and females from Thunder Game Reserve, and we actually, before they meet each other for the first time, while they're in a sedated state, we physically rub them down together and let them wake up together. And by doing this, it kind of shares the smells and the senses between them. So when they wake up, there's some kind of affiliation. But that doesn't always work 100%. And there's obviously an element of chemistry within wild dogs, be it through age, through the numbers, through the ratios, that can determine that success or failure. So I think it does work at least 90% of the time, but it doesn't always work. And it's even been documented at times with dispersal groups where you've got a group of male and females running in an area like Kruger National Park that actually meet up, join, and split again, because there's obviously not a lot of cohesion or chemistry from those dogs. So I think there's in terms of that human element that humans carry in terms of chemistry, I think wild dogs will have that to some degree. Yeah, good question. Mr. Yang, is there any enemy of these wild dogs? Yes, so I think what I've touched on today on much of the threats, the main human-induced threats are disease, roadkill, snaring, and deliberate persecution. In terms of their natural threats, it's something that we manage a lot less, because obviously at the end of the day, natural threats, it forms part of the ecosystem functioning. When a wild dog gets killed from a lion or a leopard, it's a natural process. So to answer your question, yeah, wild dogs, obviously the bigger the pack numbers, the more formidable they are and the more powerful they are. In terms of their natural threats, hyena, lions, leopards would be your three main ones. But there's also equal playing ground. So a large pack will confront some hyena or confront a leopard. A pack of 2 or 3 might run away. In the case of lions, lions will often go out of their way. It's called predation, where they'll actually try to kill wild dogs if they get the opportunity because they're trying to eliminate the threat. So obviously it's not something we ever like, but in terms of managing it, it's a lot more hands-off. Thank you very much, Michael Cleaver. I really enjoyed the story. I'm just reading through some questions, I think. When the best plan. Sorry, I'm just having a look at some of these questions. I'll answer one or two more, and then at the bottom on my screen there's an email address, or you can follow me on my Instagram page, or contact the Endangered Wildlife Trust if you do have any further questions. Just going to go to the top. A question from Samantha Morley: how long would they spend in a den before moving? It's a very good question, and if everything goes to plan, so basically, just to go through the life events, so wild dog's gestation period is 10 weeks, and they then drop. It's a very short gestation period, so that means that when the wild dogs come out, they're tiny little balls and their eyes are closed, and but they do grow up quite quickly once they are born. So generally speaking, they'll probably be in a den for about 10 weeks or so. And at that time, it's often fleas or other predators that start moving in, and that kind of pushes them to start moving off to another area, to another den site. So in terms of phases, they often have a primary den site, like a secondary den site. And then following that, when the pups are a little bit bigger, they're not quite good enough. Pups are funny because their feet grow and the ears grow faster than the rest of their body. And even though they think they're being helpful to the pack, they're really not. So what the pack usually do once they've kind of, and big enough to tag along but not hunt yet, is the pack will stash them in a kind of den type area, go off and hunt, and depending on what they've hunted, bring food back to those pups or let the pups come in and eat. But you'll find that the pack will have special stashing places where they'll keep the pups that aren't quite den sites, but it's a way of phasing away from den sites. How many members does the pack usually have? Yeah, that's a good question, Lucia. A pack at the moment, if you look at a place like Lihle and Plessis Game Reserve, we've got packs that are down to just one adult male and one adult female. In terms of how big packs get to, well, in the case of Mkuzi, that was probably one of the biggest packs you would get, where it got up to 40. But generally speaking, in terms of how wild dogs, grow and recreate, new packs or populations, they will generally, you'll have your most dominant males and females that grow up. And when they become a year or two old, they start getting, just like humans would, start getting a bit bored and frustrated, and will start slowly leaving the pack. In the early stages, they'll leave, explore, and maybe come back and start leaving and exploring. And you can actually often identify who's going to disperse from the pack because they'll start sleeping off in a group aside. And obviously, in a case where you've got, say, a litter of 10 pups, you might have 5 males and 5 females. If the males decide to disperse, it won't be all 5 males that leave. It will be two or three most dominant ones. And what's quite unique about that is those 3 will leave and look for unrelated females somewhere else, bond, and then form a pack of their own. And what's quite good about the sustainability of this is you always have your more or your less dominant dogs staying behind with the pack, because you need some dogs to stay behind to nurture the pups, to hunt, and to look after the alpha pair. So it's basically a personality choice between the most dominant and strongest dogs going, and obviously those are often the strongest genes in recreating new packs, versus some of the younger some of the less dominant dogs that might not have the leadership abilities. I think I'm going to I'll just answer one more question. I do apologize. I know there's still quite a few coming in. Yeah, it's a good question. It comes back to the human-animal conflict issues. The question is from Beverly: why did the neighboring area not want a pack of wild dogs? It's a frustration that I have too. At the moment in South Africa, including the Kruger Park, we only have about 15 protected areas in the whole country dedicated to wild dog conservation. And the more old school approach is to it's easier not to have wild dogs because they do enjoy having big territories and fences don't contain them. So with your lions and cheetah, for example, they're not very good at getting out of fences, whereas wild dogs can burrow under and explore. So especially when a pack has pups and starts dispersing, generally a fence won't contain those dogs because those dispersals are wanting to go out and find other dogs of their, to team up with. So I think from a management perspective, they are tricky. But I think the bigger issue at hand is often come back to the fact that wild dogs aren't a big five animal. So from an economic perspective, a lot of tourists, particularly international tourists, are coming and they're wanting to tick the big five off their list. And that often shies away from other animals, like wild dogs as an example. I think that mindset is changing, but yeah, I think in terms of coming back to the neighboring property, I think in that particular case, they didn't really want the responsibility of them denning on their property because they had the big five and they didn't really see the benefit of having them. But yeah, it's part of my job and it's work that we do throughout the Endangered Wildlife Trust and the Carnivore Conservation Program to promote wild dogs and to actually assist with the management of wild dogs to make it more feasible for people to have them. Because ultimately, if we can have more space owed to them, we can save them from extinction. Okay, I'm going to do one last question. I really appreciate just reading through. I really appreciate this. There's not all questions, but I really appreciate a lot of the positive comments from them. Ali had a question. While touching the wild dogs, do you ever get ticks and fleas from them to your body? Yes, the question is yes, we do sometimes. We do take precaution and we do wear gloves, but of course, when you're handling animals, it is a risk because it's not just the fleas, it's also, you kind of don't want to let the, the germs that we carry get put on the animals, and we don't want the animals and the things they carry put onto humans. So we do take precaution, we wear gloves. Whenever an animal's treated, it's, we do it in a safe environment or as much as possible. We always ensure that we clean ourselves. So I think in terms of where I've got ticks and fleas from has been when once packs have left den sites and gone on to their new den sites. I've always found it a great personal hobby of mine to go check out the dens because there's so much strategy in a wild dog den. And when you can see how the alpha female chose the den and the thought that went into it, you realize how intelligent these animals are. And I think it's something that I'll end off with is what makes this beyond the social structure and the personalities of these packs. I think what makes them really special is that they're not the fastest animal and they're certainly not the biggest. If you look at their speeds, they run 70 on as a maximum 70 k's an hour. And the average wild dog is about 25 kgs. When you consider a male lion, it weighs 250 kgs. So I went to the maths now, but a dog that's 25 and a lion that's 250 kgs is one so massive. a massive thing where things like Impala might run 90 k's an hour. Wild dogs can't keep up with those speeds. So in summary, they're a small animal and they're not the fastest. And the only reason why they've been able to survive this long is because of the pack and the coordination and the strategy and the intelligence and the emotion they share between pack members that have really got them this far. And I think ultimately the more space that we can open up towards African wild dogs, the more they will be able to kind of grow themselves and take care of themselves. They just need that little boost or start off to get that process going. Last comment from Zoe. She's a great friend of mine and a great wild dog vet. She's been at the center of many of our wild dog stories, Dr. Zoe Griffiths. Not a question, just a comment. Absolute incredible story, incredible species. Yes, we are biased, and incredible humans. Well done. You guys make us proud. Thank you very much, Zoe, and thank you for all the work you've done too with the wild dogs. I see the questions are piling up, and I'm really sorry I can't get to all of them. But I wanted to end off there and thank everybody once again for joining in on this presentation, and keep in touch. Feel free to email any questions that you do still have.